And now, Chapter 13 of The Last Boy on Earth, The Quantum Theory of Fiction. Kaylee slept more deeply than she had since the great falling of the abandonment. She slept the sleep of the dead. She journeyed into the depths of the darkness behind her eyelids until she was 1,000,000 miles away and safe at last. How she'd been rescued, this strange boy, and the unlikeliness of their situation made it all the more difficult to imagine that she hadn't been dreaming all along. When she awoke, it was to a new day, the sun filtering down from the light of the library's cupola, filling the white marbled space with a soft wash of warmth. When she opened her eyes, she felt like she might have just woken up on some goddess's couch on Mount Olympus. The statue of Thought seemed to be looking back at her with alabaster eyes, and Kaylee could have sworn that it blinked. She put her feet on the cold floor and ran her fingers through her hair, taking in a deep breath. This was safety, she thought, when she didn't need to be on her guard, always aware that a madman was actively seeking her death. She listened carefully to the sounds around her. Was that Brady's voice she heard from downstairs? Was he talking to himself again? He must be. Hadn't he told her that they were the only survivors? Would he have awakened her if somehow and during the night another survivor had showed up in the library's doorstep? She slipped on her shoes and began to descend the rounded marble staircase down to the main lobby. She could distinctly hear Brady speaking again. Poor boy, she thought. He's been alone so long and seen so much death that he's gone a little crazy talking to himself. She wondered why she hadn't gone around the bend herself when she heard a voice with a distinctly French accent speak to her. "Hello, mademoiselle. You have slept well, huh?" said the voice in a low and somewhat suave timbre. Startled, she scanned the area, but she couldn't see anyone. "Who said that?" she asked nervously. "Huh? I did. Gregoire." No, down here, mademoiselle," replied the voice. She looked down to see the squatting stone figure of a concrete reproduction gargoyle licking his hand and slicking back his invisible hair. A grin that could have melted glass stretched across his face. Kaylee wanted to scream, but when she opened her mouth, she found she couldn't draw breath. Stymied by the idea of a talking, moving piece of stone, she became stone herself, unable to talk or move. "I know. I have this effect on all women. I cannot help it. You are marveled at me, yes?" Finally, after a long moment passed, she forced words from out of her throat. "What the hell are you?" she said, trying to catch her breath. "I am the guardian of this place. I protect you last night from all the world. You slept well, no?" But you can talk," she uttered. "Oui, that is not all I can do. I am a Frenchman, after all," said Gregoire with a snicker in his demon throat. "Brady!" she shouted at the top of her lungs. "Brady!" And in a second, Brady arrived at the foot of the stairs and took stock of the situation. It was as clear as a bell to him that perhaps he should have been more upfront with Kaylee about the state of things before she went to sleep last night. "Yes?" he asked innocently. What? What do you mean, yes? This thing is talking to me." "It is?" He was pleasantly surprised, even relieved. If she heard statues talk, then either they were both insane, or neither of them were. He continued. "Oh, well, yes, it is. Has he been appropriate? Sometimes he's a little mouthy." "Huh? Me?" replied the gargoyle. "I am the soul of honor and respectability. I never," sputtered the squatting stone guardian. He crossed his well-muscled arms and turned his head, staring a hole through the wall. Brady smiled bravely at Kaylee's frightened and confused face. How was he to explain all of this, he wondered? How could he make sense of how the world had changed? "I know, he's a talking statue. I see a lot of them lately." Kaylee's eyes widened even more. "You mean there are more talking statues?" "Yeah, well, a couple," he managed. "I don't see what the problem is. I was merely being polite to her. There is no reason to be so offy," he said, and he crossed his little stone arms and turned his head away indignantly. "Oh, I see," Brady said quietly, a smirk washing over his face. He likes you. Kaylee walked past Gregoire's squatting form, hugging the wall tightly as she did so. Who were you talking to just now? She asked. Who were you talking to just now? She asked directly. What, me? Just now? Asked Brady with false innocence. Don't lie to me. I know you're hiding something from me. And Brady saw clearly that he had no choice but to tell her the truth, however improbable and insane it might sound. Okay, just hear me out. This is going to sound weird, but it's the truth, at least as I see it, okay? The world's changed. We've changed. There are monsters now. And there are also statues that can talk. And that person you heard me talking to just now? You heard me talking to a book, he began. A book? How can you talk to a book, she asked. Oh, it's easy. You just take it in your hands and open it up, he replied. No doubt, that's what my English teachers always told me, except it's wrong. The book talks to you, she replied. Yes, he answered, but sometimes you have to wake it up. And from his back pocket, the paperback edition of the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin began to speak. She is shrewd and cunning, this one. No beating about the bush. Tell her the truth, Brady, but say it well. Don't stumble over your words. From a slip of the foot you may soon recover, but a slip of the tongue you may never get over. Brady anticipated that she couldn't hear Ben, at least not yet, but he considered his next words well. Kaylee was a force to be reckoned with, and even though he didn't want to admit it, he couldn't take his gaze from her. She was something more than a mere girl. But what? How can books talk? How can statues come to life and walk the earth? Brady, are you seriously listening to me? None of this makes sense. This world no longer made any sense to her, and she was looking for some kind of answer from her only human companion, who seemed to be perfectly at ease with everything. Yeah, I know it seems wrong. It doesn't make any sense, Brady replied. But I've been thinking about it for a long, long time, trying to make a theory where everything works. I think I get it. Wide-eyed and still spooked by the words of the gargoyle, Kaylee said, Really? Enlighten me. Explain it. I'm all ears. Brady offered her his hand and smiled. Come on, follow me. I think this might make more sense in another room. Impatiently, she moved toward him, and only inches from his face she urged, Another room? What's wrong with this one? Well, we're on the stairs, Brady replied, but it might make more sense if we're surrounded by books. She glared at him, but he just kept smiling, awaiting her reply. Realizing that this was his game and his place, she had little choice. She slapped her hand angrily into his and led him away into the new fiction room. There was a long handmade ash table in the center with 8 handmade chairs surrounding it, lining the walls 10 feet high with accompanying rolling ladders, were the newest and final works of fiction that this library would ever require, all arranged alphabetically according to the author's last name. An objet d'art, resembling a steampunk airplane, was suspended over the table. Kaylee pulled out a chair and sat down at the head of the table, crossing her arms and pursing her lips in frustration. Brady sat at the far end, as far away from her as he could manage. Everything I'm about to tell you is going to sound crazy, but you've got to remember the monster we fought in the hospital. I know you think it was a human, doctor, but I saw a monster. It was real, and it wasn't human. In the world of before, monsters were things in books and movies, from the imagination. But in the abandonment, monsters walk the earth. I don't know why, but the world has changed. Statues move, some talk. Books can speak to us in words we can hear, not just words we read. And there are other things, like ghosts that whisper to me when I sleep, and a whole graveyard full of specters waiting around like they need to go on a journey except the train is late. She felt in her heart that Brady was creating a scenario that made sense to him, however unlikely. But there had been a small talking Frenchman in the form of a gargoyle hitting on her just a few minutes ago on the stairs. This turn of events changed her perspective. I know you're not crazy, but I was shut up in a building for the last few weeks trying to stay one step ahead of Dr. Grindle, or a monster, for lack of a better word. And I watched everyone die. I didn't sleep through it. So if any one of us ought to be crazy, it's me, and I'm not crazy. These things we're seeing don't make any sense. They simply can't be real. But they are, he said, letting the idea slowly sink in. Everything we see is real, Brady said, beginning his explanation. Everything that can be imagined is also real. Kaylee shook her head. No, Brady, it isn't. I can imagine that you're a white rabbit and that my name is Alice, but that doesn't make it real. She thought to herself, I'm going to wipe that grin right off your face, buddy, if you don't stop talking like an idiot. Let me explain. You have to promise not to get angry if I explain, he asked. Yes, but only if you keep it quick. I promise. Good. Brady walked around the table every so often, pulling out a book from the shelf and putting it on the table. He found a few and set them up in a straight line on the table in front of Kaylee. He began. Each one of these books is a story that came from the mind of its author. Each of them takes place somewhere. Each one has a setting. We were taught in school that a story is fiction unless it's a work of nonfiction, and if the author does a good job, when we read the book, our imaginations bring that world to life. And we go to Wonderland. We go to Mordor. We travel with Sam and Frodo. Hogwarts is a real castle in the Scottish Highlands, at least while we're reading the book. Kaylee nodded. She understood what he was talking about. Books did have a life of their own, but it was a lower form of life than the real world. Their reality was tempered by the imperfections of their authors' imaginations. Imagined worlds were incomplete. No author could imagine a world wholly. See, I figured this out a while ago, even before the abandonment. Oh, sorry, I keep renaming things. Anyway, before the pandemic, I had an idea. Are you familiar with the quantum theory of multiple universes? Yes. Well, sorta, was her response. Nodding his head, Brady continued. I don't really understand it either, but I know that the best minds on Earth had a theory about our universe being one of an infinite number of other universes. We can't see them or touch them, but they exist. Astrophysicists even show you the math to prove it. See, the theory came about because of quantum mechanics. What? How does a kid like you know about quantum mechanics? She asked incredulously. She was the top of her class in both math and science, and what she knew about quantum mechanics could be written down on the back of a ticket stub. Brady shrugged. Wikipedia? A look of acknowledgement came over her face, and she answered simply, Oh. Anyway, these astrophysicists claimed that there is an infinity of universes out there, and some of them have life in them, some of them don't. Some of them have the same laws of physics that we do, others have different laws. One idea is that all of these universes are like leaves on a tree, all sprouting from the same branch. Kaylee had no idea where this was going, but she was now intrigued. Infinite universes, huh? Well, that means there's a universe out there where everyone else is still alive? The idea held some promise for her, even if it seemed far-fetched. Brady nodded. Yeah, probably. But we can't get there. We're here in this room, this universe. There aren't any doorways. Keep going, she said, this time averting her eyes from Brady's gaze. So the idea caught my attention. You see, one of those astrophysicists I read about said that there are an infinite number of these other universes. Infinite, right? Now that's hard to imagine, isn't it? I mean, how much is infinity? So I thought about it, and I thought about it, and I thought some more. And finally it came to me. Infinite means never ending, forever growing, always more. And I thought anything that could be imagined could exist in one of these other universes. Anything. All the books I've read and loved weren't just figments of the author's imaginations. They were real. The authors imagined, and anything that can be imagined can be real in one of these infinite universes. They could exist in another universe. I mean, Middle-earth could be real. Mount Olympus could truly exist. In some other universe, SpongeBob SquarePants lives in a pineapple under the sea, and he's real. Kaylee wanted to give him the look of death, roll her eyes, and laugh in his face with a single, yeah, right, but she didn't. She couldn't. She'd witnessed the possibilities and the impossibilities with her own eyes. She'd fought a monster with a katana and sliced off its fingers. She'd watched as the world fell around her, and here she was in the Bangor Public Library's fiction room, listening to a boy younger than her explain why books and statues can talk. See, books are more than stories that keep us entertained. Remember that I said that there aren't doorways to these other universes in the multiverse? Well, that's what the scientists told us, but they were wrong. They didn't use their imagination like they should have. You mean there are ways to access these other universes? Asked Kaylee. Yes. Books are portals. They're doorways to these other universes. These stories are the only way we can visit them. We can't go to them with our bodies, but we can voyage to them with our minds. Without realizing it, authors figured out a way to travel through the multiverse. People just didn't realize these places were real in a quantum kind of way. Kaylee looked at Brady for a long moment, considering his words. Full of surprises, the boy claimed that the world has changed, and what a world, she thought, when a 14-year-old boy could piece together a quantum theory of fiction, books as doorways to other universes similar and yet different from our own. Okay, Kaylee said, looking at the books on the table in front of her. Well, how does this explain how you can hear Benjamin Franklin and that little gargoyle wants to look up my dress? Brady laughed. It was the first laugh he'd had in a very long time. It's like this. Anything that can be imagined is real, somewhere in another universe. Anything that can be imagined, except that there's no one around to imagine anymore, is there except for you and me. All the possible universes, do they still exist if we're not here to imagine them? Kaylee waited for the idea to sink in, and she waited a very long time, pondering it, tasting it in her mind, ruminating. He had an interesting point. She asked, so you think that by imagining these other realities we make them real, and if we don't imagine them, they aren't? Brady couldn't meet her eyes for long, but he said quietly, I don't know. Is there a universe out there where everyone is still alive? If I imagine it, does it become real? Or was it always there, a universe right next to our own, right now? And if I imagine it, does it pop into existence, or has it always been there? I don't know. If no one is left to imagine, does the other universe cease to exist? She asked. They looked at each other for a long time without speaking, each hoping the other would venture an answer. Brady finally replied, I don't know, but I think that the books, the statues, and everything is responding to imagination. And I think that we're it. And here's the big secret. Here's the thing that Einstein and Stephen Hawking probably knew, but they weren't foolish enough to reveal to the world. I think the multiverse requires imagination. It runs on it. It's the fuel that powers everything, and there's no one left to dream, to think, to make things up, just us. And I think the world is waking up, responding to our imaginations. Someone is imagining things alive. A palpable silence fell across the length of the reading room, but Kaylee could have sworn she heard the whispering of 1,000 voices chiming like tinkling bells in the distant wind, as though the books were calling out to her from unimaginable distances. Who's imagining these things to life? Could it be someone here or in another universe imagining us? I mean, is there some writer in another universe who's putting our story down on paper, imagining us? Asked Kaylee. Brady shook his head. There could be a writer, or maybe it's a reader reading the book he wrote. I mean, maybe it's a kid in middle school reading a book called The Last Boy on Earth. I don't know. Kaylee saw a movement from the corner of her eye in the new acquisitions room. It was Gregoire, looking at her from a distance with eyes the size of silver dollars and a dreamy smile smeared across his rugged face. What do you want? She asked. Did you just ask a statue a question? Asked Brady. No, of course not. Well, wait a second. Oh, my God, I did. Am I going crazy? It doesn't take long to get used to, he answered. Oh, she is so, how you say, delicious. Oh, Monsieur Brady, you have made this place a palace. She is our queen. Oh, shut up, she said sternly. Gregoire smiled, for Kaylee addressed him. He winked at Brady and turned, waddling back to the main room of the library to continue his vigil, reaching his long-clawed head behind him to scratch his left buttock. They sat in silence for a few moments. Kaylee began to notice small movements in the paintings hanging on the wall. Did the painting of Molly Molasses, tribal elder of the Penobscot Nation, painted so long ago, just smile slightly and nod to her? When she concentrated, she could hear the faint whisperings of the books on the shelves. She thought to herself, This can't be real. I know better. It's impossible. Her logical voice responded to her wondering side. If you were crazy, you wouldn't know it, would you? And if you knew it, it would mean you weren't crazy, only that you thought you were. And if you thought you were crazy, you wouldn't be, would you? Brady could see the look in her light blue eyes, and he understood. I have someone I'd like you to meet, he said. He might be able to shed some light on this weird new world. It's Brave New World, you know, a book by Huxley and a line from Shakespeare, she replied. Oh, yeah, sure, he answered, somewhat annoyed. There's someone else? She asked. In a manner of speaking, he replied hopefully. He's not real, is he? He's as real as we are. He's just not as human. She stared at him, and for a moment she looked away and shook her head and replied, Oh, what the hell? The statue of General Joshua Chamberlain stood as a sentinel overlooking the Penobscot River on its course down to the bay, and therefore the ocean and the world. He stood with his sword dangling from his belt, his hat tucked neatly into his belt, and his arms crossed. An expression of stony silence covered his face, and belied no suspicion that he was a talking statue. Brady parked the life-seeker in the parking lot of the old Irving at the entrance to the small park dominated by the statue of the general. She had said little to Brady on the short drive over the bridge from the library. There was so much of nothing to look at, so much of what should be and wasn't. It was like looking at a picture of your family with everyone but you cut away by some madman with a pair of insane scissors. I want you to have an open mind about what you're going to see and hear, Brady said in low tones as they approached the base of the statue. He's been like my advisor, and he was the first thing in the world I came across that was alive to me. He's pretty cool, too. He's wise, and he has a boss sword. Kaylee nodded and followed him down the path. She stood behind Brady, and he told her to stand a short distance away so that the general could get a good look at her. General, Brady began, I have someone I'd like you to meet. Her name is Kaylee Tremble. She didn't expect what happened to happen, even though a stone gargoyle from New Jersey had just hit on her in the library. She knew this statue. She knew Joshua Chamberlain from the 2 different reports she had written on him for 5th and 8th grade. She had driven by him 1,000 times and barely ever looked this way. He was something put there by well-meaning, historically minded citizens intent on keeping him forever linked with his boyhood home of Brewer. Her eyes were frozen wide as the statue slowly tipped its head down for a better look, and the metal eyes rolled in the metal head, while the metal mouth opened and a human voice came forth, saying, Pleased to make your acquaintance, young lady. I am at your service. Later she would marvel at her actions because she didn't know from what hidden well of courtesy she lowered her gaze and replied, Sir, I am at your service. The metal man smiled and said nothing more. Sir, I'm sorry to bother you this morning, but we have some questions, and since you seem to know so much about, well, the way things are now, I wonder if you wouldn't mind. Brady, I am at your service, too. I have little else to do, it seems. Kaylee and Brady sat down in the front of the statue as the warmth of a summer morning began to fall upon them. She was thunderstruck, and went right to the source of her conundrum. How is it that you can talk? How is it that anything that looks remotely human or has a connection with humans seems to be able to talk or even move about? It doesn't make sense to me. Chamberlain tilted his head a little to the left and then to the right before bringing his gaze back to the pair below him. Well, I am uncertain as to the means of my awakening. I am not Joshua Chamberlain. I'm not the Chamberlain I represent. He passed away years ago and left this place. I do seem to remember things he wrote, events he may have seen, even conversations he may have had. I think in his way as though I possess his engrams. Is that right? Engrams? Do I know this word? I'm puzzled and troubled by all of this as well, Kaylee. Well, can you remember specific details? Can you remember your actions at Little Round Top? The general paused and looked away for a moment, accessing some deep idea from wherever his seat of memory lived. Do you know my history? He asked plainly. I've done my research. I know something about Chamberlain. Ah, do you? Well, can you tell me, did I like birds? Did I enjoy the outdoors? I can't remember that. You did, she replied. You were a scholar. You taught yourself Greek in a year. You were bookish before the war, and after the war you spent a lot of time on the coast when you weren't being called on to stop a riot or travel to France or even attend Grant's funeral. The general nodded as memories were created where they had not existed before. I do not know how I came to be. I am much like you, I suppose. I mean, who knows how they were given the power of thought and memory? Consciousness is such a strange thing. Is it so hard to imagine that when all have been taken away by contagion or war, that part of them remains? Perhaps I am part of what remains. Brady had heard something akin to this before from the general, but Kaylee was weighing this for the first time, and her mind was more logical than his, less likely to believe in chimeras of the imagination. Nothing remains. I'm insane. I'm living in a dream, a nightmare. None of this is real. I'm still in the hospital, and the monster's still after me, or worse, he got me, and this is where he put me, inside of a nightmare, she said in anger and frustration. No, Kaylee, you are wrong. You deny your own senses, and these may be the only things that you can trust. Think about your own true self. The person the world knew as Kaylee still exists, even though she is confused. I exist, even though people no longer walk the earth except for you. I wrote about it once, or rather, he did. What could he possibly have said about the situation we're in? Said Kaylee, still sure she was tipping towards the brink of insanity. The general spoke the words from some deeper well of understanding that either Kaylee or Brady possessed. He spoke from the mind of a man long dead, yet whose words were still lingering in his consciousness. She looked off into the distance, and Brady was stunned to see him move his hand from his side and raise it over his heart in gratitude and remembrance of deeds long past. In great deeds, something abides. On great fields, something stays. Forms change and pass. Bodies disappear. But spirits linger, to consecrate ground for the vision place of souls. And reverent men and women from afar, and generations that know us not, and that we know not of, heart drawn to see where and by whom great things were suffered and done for them, shall come to this deathless field to ponder and dream. And lo, the shadow of a mighty presence shall wrap them in its bosom, and the power of the vision pass into their souls. The pair let the words fall over them and settled down deep into their pores before saying a thing. He had just spoken words to remember the Battle of Gettysburg, but somehow these words seemed to apply to them. Brady wondered aloud. Forms change and pass. Bodies disappear, but spirits linger to consecrate the ground for the vision place of souls? As if reading his thoughts, he heard Kaylee mutter, vision place of souls? It is my belief that I have come to life, so to speak, so that those who still walk the earth will not forget Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. All of the other homunculi who seem to be focal points for a kind of memorial energy, yes, even if all the people have passed, somehow the world itself refuses to forget what has passed and longs for the presence of its people. Perhaps these are the musings of a foolish old scholar looking for an easy answer. But I am certain of one thing. You two have been spared for a reason. Forces have brought you together beyond your control. Your survival is not less miraculous than my own awakening. Kaylee moved directly in front of the statues so that he could not tip his head down to see her, and instead he looked again out over the long Penobscot River. What about the killer in the hospital? What's he? She asked simply. The general did not reply immediately, but then he said, I do not know. That is for you to determine as you stand and face him. Your enemy is often less strange to you than you might think. The monster we slay today may be the brother we mourn tomorrow. Kaylee screamed a short burst of frustration and walked away, arms crossed. She stood at the edge of the hill and gazed out over the city beyond her. Brady watched her in fascination. She was wonderful, he thought. How could he help her understand and even accept some of the things that had come to live with so easily? It was going to be an uphill battle. I am sorry, Brady, said the general in a quiet tone. I am as puzzled as you, but I believe, such as I am, I was put here for a purpose. We are all here for a purpose, and it is our duty to determine what that purpose might be. She's angry, and rightfully so. Give her some time, and she'll begin to accept the way things have come to be. I hope so, sir. I sure hope so. End of chapter.